The rain hammered the precinct windows like a warning no one wanted to hear. Lieutenant Sarah Collins stood in the observation room, arms crossed, watching Derek Sullivan walk out of custody with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. 48 hours of interrogation, forensic sweeps, warrants executed across 3 counties, and still the district attorney had nothing solid enough to hold him. The evidence was circumstantial, the witnesses unreliable, and Sullivan's legal team moved like sharks through every procedural gap they could find. The case was dying in real time, and everyone in the Atlanta Police Department could feel it slipping through their fingers like water through a broken dam. Sullivan paused at the exit, adjusting his tailored jacket and glancing back toward the holding area. For just a fraction of a second, his expression shifted. It wasn't relief or vindication. It was something colder, more calculated. Sarah recognized it instantly because she had seen it before in suspects who believed they were untouchable, who knew they had beaten the system not through innocence but through superior strategy. He nodded once toward the cameras, a gesture so subtle that most officers would have missed it entirely, and then he was gone into the gray Atlanta afternoon, where his attorneys waited with umbrellas and prepared statements about justice prevailing. Sarah turned away from the window and felt the weight of failure pressing against her ribs. Max sat beside her, his dark eyes following her every movement with the kind of attention that came from years of partnership. The Belgian Malinois wore his black tactical harness with the Atlanta PD insignia stitched across the chest. His tan and black coat, still damp from their earlier patrol through the warehouse district where they had initially arrested Sullivan. He sensed her frustration without needing words, his ears tilting forward in silent question. She reached down and scratched behind his ears, feeling the tension in his muscles that mirrored her own. The bullpen beyond the observation room was loud with the sound of phones ringing, keyboards clattering, officers arguing about case assignments and court dates. Detective Marcus Webb appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened and his face showing the exhaustion of 3 consecutive night shifts. He carried 2 cups of coffee, one of which he extended toward Sarah without preamble. She accepted it and tasted the bitter edge of precinct brew that had been sitting on the burner too long. Webb leaned against the wall and gestured toward the empty hallway where Sullivan had vanished. "Captain wants the case files archived by end of shift. Says we need to move on to cases we can actually prosecute." Sarah took another sip of coffee, buying herself time to choose her words carefully. Sullivan wasn't nervous. Not the way innocent people are nervous when they're released after being accused of something they didn't do. He was confident, too confident. "Maybe because he's actually innocent," Webb suggested, though his tone indicated he didn't believe it any more than she did, "or because he knows we missed something." Webb sighed and rubbed his eyes. "We swept that warehouse 6 times, Sarah, brought in narcotics dogs, forensics, even brought Max through twice. If there was evidence there, we would have found it." Max's ears perked up at the sound of his name, and he shifted his weight, looking between the 2 humans as if trying to pass their conversation. Sarah glanced down at him and saw something in his posture that made her pause. He wasn't relaxed the way he usually was when a case closed. His focus kept drifting toward the hallway that led to the holding cells, his nose twitching as if catching a scent that lingered just beyond his ability to identify it clearly. "What about the cell?" Sarah asked suddenly. Webb frowned. "What about it? Did anyone sweep Sullivan's holding cell after he was processed out?" "Why would we? He was only there for 48 hours. Standard holding protocol. The cell gets cleaned and reassigned to whoever comes through booking next." Sarah set down her coffee cup and looked at Max again. The K-9's attention was still fixed on that hallway, his body language shifting from passive to alert in the subtle way that only someone who had worked with him for years would recognize. It was the same stance he took when he detected something during a search, that focused intensity that meant his senses had locked onto something worth investigating. "I want to take Max through one more time." Sarah said. Webb looked at her like she had suggested they reopen the investigation based on a horoscope. Through what? The cell. Sarah, come on. Sullivan sat in there for 2 days doing nothing but sleeping and talking to his lawyers. There's nothing to find. Then it won't take long to confirm that. Captain's going to think you're wasting resources. Captain can think whatever he wants. I'm doing one final sweep before they sanitize that space. Webb studied her face for a long moment, then shrugged in resignation. You want company? No. Just need to clear my head. Max and I will handle it. She walked past him into the hallway, Max falling into step beside her with the practiced ease of a partner who knew her rhythms better than most humans did. The precinct sounds faded as they moved deeper into the building, past the processing area where suspects were photographed and fingerprinted, past the interview rooms with their scarred metal tables and two-way mirrors, until they reached the holding block where temporary cells lined both sides of a narrow corridor, lit by flickering fluorescent tubes that gave everything a sickly green tinge. Sullivan's cell was third from the left, its door standing open and its interior bare except for a metal bench bolted to the wall and a steel toilet in the corner. The concrete walls were painted institutional beige, chipped and marked with the scratches and graffiti of countless previous occupants who had spent hours or days waiting for bail hearings or transfers to county lockup. It smelled like disinfectant and desperation, the same smell every holding cell carried regardless of who occupied it. Sarah stood in the doorway and gestured toward the interior. Max, search. The command was simple, direct, and immediately effective. Max moved forward into the cell with his nose down, working in the methodical grid pattern they had trained for years. He circled the perimeter first, checking the corners and the base of the walls where scents tended to pool and concentrate. Sarah watched him work with the kind of focus that came from trusting his instincts more than any technology or human intuition. She had seen him find contraband, hidden in wheel wells, detect explosives buried under concrete, locate missing persons in collapsed buildings. His nose processed information at a molecular level, detecting chemical signatures that no machine could replicate. He completed his first pass without alerting, but instead of relaxing or looking back at her for release from the command, he paused near the back wall and tilted his head. His ears came forward, and his body stiffened into the focused stance that meant he was processing something unusual. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She stepped into the cell and watched as Max approached the wall again, this time more deliberately. He sniffed along the baseboard, then moved higher, working his way up the painted concrete in a pattern that seemed almost random, until he stopped at chest height and began pawing at a specific section of the wall. The scratching sound echoed in the small space, Max's claws dragging against the concrete with increasing insistence. Sarah moved closer and examined the area he was focused on. At first glance, it looked identical to every other section of the wall, painted beige, slightly textured, showing the same wear and minor damage as the rest of the cell. But Max wouldn't behave this way without reason. He was insistent now, alternating between scratching and pressing his nose directly against the surface as if trying to push through it. "What do you smell, boy?" Sarah murmured, running her own fingers over the wall. The surface felt solid, unremarkable, but Max continued pawing at it, his focus absolute. She pulled out her phone and activated the flashlight, angling the beam across the wall at different positions to catch any irregularities in the surface. Under the direct light, she could see faint lines forming a rectangular outline, barely visible, but definitely present. The paint inside the rectangle was slightly different in texture, as if it had been applied more recently than the surrounding area. She pressed against it experimentally and felt the tiniest bit of give, movement so subtle she would have dismissed it as imagination if Max hadn't been alerting on the exact same spot. Sarah stepped back into the corridor and called out, "Webb, I need you down here." His response echoed from somewhere deeper in the precinct, muffled and irritated. "What now?" "Just get down here. Bring a crowbar and a flashlight." 5 minutes later, Webb appeared with the requested tools and an expression that suggested he was humoring her purely out of professional courtesy. He looked at Max, who was still focused on the wall, then at Sarah's face, and his skepticism softened slightly. "You're serious about this?" Max doesn't alert without reason. Webb approached the wall and examined the area Sarah indicated. He ran his hand over the surface, feeling the same subtle irregularity she had detected. "Could be old repair work. These cells get damaged all the time. Maintenance patches them up." "Check the maintenance logs," Sarah said. "See if this cell was repaired recently." Webb pulled out his phone and scrolled through the department's maintenance database. After a moment, he shook his head. "Last repair logged for this cell was 9 months ago. Broken bench hinge." Sarah looked at Max, who was sitting now but still staring at the wall with unbroken attention. "Open it." Webb positioned the crowbar against the edge of the rectangular outline and applied pressure. The wall resisted at first, then suddenly gave way with a crack of breaking plaster. A section of the wall swung inward like a small door, revealing a hollow cavity carved into the concrete block behind the painted surface. The space was roughly 12 inches square and 6 inches deep, and it wasn't empty. Inside the cavity lay 3 items, carefully wrapped in clear plastic. 2 USB flash drives, a folded stack of papers, and a small notebook with a black cover. Everything was pristine, protected from moisture and damage by the plastic wrapping and the sealed environment. Sarah felt adrenaline surge through her system as she pulled on latex gloves and carefully extracted each item from its hiding place. Max wagged his tail once, satisfied that his work had been acknowledged, then returned to his alert posture as if expecting more hidden compartments to be discovered. Webb stared at the contents like he was watching a magic trick he couldn't explain. How the hell did Sullivan build this? He was only in here 48 hours. "He didn't build it," Sarah said quietly, turning one of the flash drives over in her gloved hand. "This was already here. He knew about it before he was even arrested." "That means someone inside the department helped him." Sarah met Webb's eyes and saw her own realization reflected there. If Sullivan had known about this compartment, if he had been confident enough to use it during his brief detention, then he had inside knowledge of the precinct's layout and security protocols. That kind of access didn't come from casual observation. It came from someone who worked here, who understood the blind spots and the patterns, who could create a dead-drop location that would survive routine inspections and cell turnovers. "We need to secure this evidence immediately," Sarah said. "No one else touches it. We log it directly to the forensics lab and keep the chain of custody airtight." Webb nodded and pulled out his phone to make the necessary calls. Sarah carefully placed each item into separate evidence bags, documenting the process with photographs and detailed notes. Max watched the entire procedure with interest, occasionally sniffing toward the evidence bags, but maintaining his professional distance. When the documentation was complete, Sarah sealed the bags and headed toward the forensics lab with Webb following close behind. The forensics lab occupied the basement level of the precinct, a climate-controlled space filled with examination tables, microscopes, computer terminals, and locked storage cabinets containing everything from DNA samples to bullet casings. The night shift technician was a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, whose reputation for thoroughness and discretion made her the ideal person to handle sensitive evidence. She looked up from her computer terminal as Sarah and Webb entered, her expression shifting from routine interest to sharp focus when she saw the evidence bags. "Lieutenant Collins, Detective Webb, what do you have?" Sarah placed the bags on the examination table and explained the discovery. Chen listened without interruption, her face betraying nothing as she absorbed the implications. When Sarah finished, Chen pulled on her own gloves and carefully opened the first evidence bag containing the flash drives. "I can start with these," Chen said, connecting one of the drives to an isolated computer system designed to prevent any potential malware from spreading through the department's network. But if these contain encrypted data, it could take time to crack. How much time? Depends on the encryption method. Could be hours, could be days. "We don't have days," Sarah said. "Sullivan walked out of here 3 hours ago. By now, he knows we might find this cache. He'll be moving to cover his tracks." Chen's fingers flew across the keyboard as she initialized the forensic analysis software. The screen filled with file directories and encrypted folders, strings of code that looked like gibberish to anyone without specialized training. She frowned at the display and tapped a few more keys, then sat back with an expression that was equal parts impressed and concerned. "This is military-grade encryption," Chen said. "Not something you buy off the shelf. Whoever set this up had access to serious resources. Can you break it?" "Eventually, but I'll need to bring in our encryption specialist. He's off shift right now." "Call him in," Webb said. "This is priority 1. While Chen made the call, Sarah opened the evidence bag containing the folded papers. She spread them out on the examination table and felt her stomach tighten as she recognized what she was looking at. The documents were shipping manifests, customs forms, and transaction records, all bearing official stamps and signatures from various international ports and regulatory agencies. But the details didn't match any legitimate business operations. The listed cargo contents were pharmaceutical supplies, but the quantities and destinations suggested something far more sinister than legal medication transport. Webb leaned over her shoulder, reading the same documents. "These are smuggling routes. Sullivan wasn't just dealing locally. This is international trafficking." Sarah flipped through the pages and found a document that made her pause. It was a memo printed on official FBI letterhead, addressed to someone identified only as Blackwood, and signed by someone whose name had been redacted with heavy black marker. The content was coded and vague, but the implications were clear enough. Sullivan had been working with federal protection, his operations sanctioned or at least overlooked by someone with serious authority. "This changes everything," Sarah said quietly. "Sullivan isn't just a criminal. He's an asset." Webb straightened up and ran his hand through his hair. "If the feds are protecting him, then reopening this case is going to put us in direct conflict with federal jurisdiction. I don't care about jurisdiction. I care about the law. Sarah, you know how this works. If Sullivan is part of a federal operation, they'll bury any evidence we bring forward. They'll claim national security, seal the records, and we'll be the ones who end up under investigation for interfering." Sarah looked down at Max, who was lying beside the examination table with his head resting on his paws, his eyes tracking every movement in the room. He had done his job perfectly, following his training and trusting his instincts even when everyone else had been ready to close the case and move on. She couldn't betray that trust by letting politics and bureaucracy override what was obviously criminal activity. "Then we build a case they can't bury," Sarah said. "We document everything. We follow every lead, and we make sure there's enough public evidence that they can't make it disappear quietly." Chen looked up from her computer terminal, where she was still analyzing the flash drive contents. "I found something. These drives contain GPS coordinates, hundreds of them, along with timestamps and coded references. If I cross-reference these with known shipping routes and port schedules, we might be able to identify specific locations where Sullivan's network operates." Sarah moved to look at the screen. The coordinates formed a pattern across multiple continents, concentrated in port cities and border crossing points, from Savannah to Rotterdam to Hong Kong. Each coordinate was tagged with alphanumeric codes that likely corresponded to specific shipments or contacts. It was a global network, far more extensive than anything the Atlanta PD had suspected when they first arrested Sullivan. "Print everything," Sarah ordered. "I want hard copies as backup in case these files mysteriously get corrupted." Chen nodded and sent the documents to the secure printer. While the pages emerged one by one, Sarah opened the final evidence bag and examined the small black notebook. The pages were filled with handwritten notes in tight, precise script, a mixture of names, dates, amounts of money, and cryptic abbreviations that would require analysis to decode. But one name appeared repeatedly throughout the notebook, circled and underlined in a way that suggested importance: Meridian Solutions. Webb noticed her focus on that particular entry. "What's Meridian Solutions?" "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." She pulled out her phone and ran a quick search for the company name. The results showed a corporate entity registered in Delaware with business addresses in Atlanta, Miami, and Los Angeles. According to its public profile, Meridian Solutions was a pharmaceutical distribution company specializing in international logistics for medical supplies. The company's board of directors included several names Sarah didn't recognize, but one entry made her stop scrolling. Listed as a senior consultant was a retired FBI agent named Robert Castellano, whose career had included decades in organized crime investigations and international operations. "FBI connection confirmed," Sarah said, showing the phone screen to Webb. "Castellano's name keeps appearing in federal cases involving asset protection and informant management." "So Sullivan's operation is protected at the federal level through this pharmaceutical company," Webb concluded. "They're using legitimate business infrastructure to move illegal shipments, and anyone who investigates gets shut down by federal jurisdiction claims." Sarah closed her phone and looked at the assembled evidence spread across the examination table. 3 items pulled from a hidden compartment in a holding cell, and already they were uncovering a conspiracy that reached from local street-level crime to international corporate networks with federal protection. The scope was staggering, but it also meant there were vulnerabilities. Operations this large created paper trails, involved too many people, and required constant coordination that could be disrupted if the right pressure points were identified. "We need to move fast," Sarah said. "Chen, how long until your encryption specialist gets here?" 20 minutes. He's coming from home." "Good. While we wait, I want you to cross-reference every coordinate on those flash drives with Meridian Solutions shipping records. See if there's correlation between Sullivan's network and the company's official operations." Chen nodded and returned to her keyboard. Sarah turned to Webb. "I need you to pull all available surveillance footage from the precinct for the past 72 hours. Focus on the holding block. If someone inside helped Sullivan prepare that compartment, there might be video evidence." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to find out where Derek Sullivan went after he walked out of here." Sarah left the forensics lab with Max at her side, climbing the stairs back to the main precinct level. The building was quieter now in the late evening, most of the day shift having departed, and the skeleton night crew handling routine calls and paperwork. She headed to her office, a small space barely large enough for a desk, filing cabinet, and a dog bed in the corner, where Max spent hours during administrative workdays. She powered up her computer and accessed the department's case management system, pulling up Sullivan's file and reviewing every detail they had collected during the initial investigation. Sullivan was 39 years old, born in Charleston, South Carolina, with a background in supply chain management and international trade. His criminal record was minimal. A few minor charges in his 20s that had been expunged, nothing that suggested the kind of sophisticated operation they were now uncovering. He had maintained a clean public profile, working for various logistics companies before founding his own consulting firm 5 years ago. That firm, according to tax records, had contracts with several pharmaceutical companies, including Meridian Solutions. Sarah cross-referenced Sullivan's known associates and found a pattern. Most of his professional contacts had backgrounds in freight forwarding, customs brokerage, and pharmaceutical distribution. These were the kinds of roles that provided access to international shipping networks and the regulatory knowledge needed to move products across borders without attracting attention. If someone wanted to smuggle contraband using legitimate business channels, these were exactly the people they would need on their team. Max lifted his head from where he'd been resting and looked toward the office door. A moment later, Sarah heard footsteps approaching. Captain Raymond Garrett appeared in the doorway, his grey hair disheveled, and his expression showing the weariness of a career officer who had seen too many cases complicated by politics and jurisdiction disputes. He held a coffee mug in one hand and a manila folder in the other. "Lieutenant Collins, I heard you made an interesting discovery in the holding block." Sarah straightened in her chair. "Yes, sir. K-9 Max alerted on a hidden compartment in Derek Sullivan's cell. We recovered flash drives, documents, and a notebook containing evidence of international trafficking operations." Garrett stepped into the office and closed the door behind him. The gesture was subtle but significant, indicating this conversation was meant to be private. He sat down in the chair across from Sarah's desk and set his coffee mug aside. "I also heard that the evidence includes FBI letterhead and connections to a federal asset protection program." "That's correct, sir." Garrett was quiet for a moment, his eyes moving from Sarah to Max and back again. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of experience and caution. "Sarah, you're about to step into a situation that could end your career. Federal asset protection programs exist in gray areas where law enforcement objectives sometimes conflict with prosecution. If Sullivan is part of an ongoing federal operation, then reopening this case makes us adversaries of people who have far more resources and authority than we do. With respect, Captain, if Sullivan is committing crimes under federal protection, that's corruption, not law enforcement. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying you need to understand what you're walking into. The FBI doesn't take kindly to local departments interfering with their operations, even when those operations look questionable from the outside." "What would you do, sir?" Garrett picked up his coffee mug and took a long sip, buying time to consider his answer. 20 years ago, I would have done exactly what you're planning. I would have built the case, gathered the evidence, and damn the consequences. But I've also seen good officers lose everything because they couldn't accept that sometimes the system protects the wrong people for what someone in power believes are the right reasons. So, you're telling me to drop this? I'm telling you to be smart about it, document everything, build your case with absolute precision. And understand that when you move against Sullivan, you're not just challenging a criminal, you're challenging an entire network that includes federal agents, corporate executives, and people whose names you'll never even learn." Sarah met his eyes and saw something there that gave her hope. Garrett wasn't ordering her to stand down. He was warning her about the battlefield while simultaneously giving her permission to enter it. It was the kind of nuanced support that came from a commander who understood the difference between following orders and doing what was right. "I understand, Captain. I'll be careful." Garrett stood and moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "One more thing. If this goes badly and you need someone to take responsibility, make sure it lands on me, not you. I'm 2 years from retirement. You've got a career ahead of you." "Sir, I can't—" "That's an order, Lieutenant." He left before she could respond, his footsteps fading down the hallway. Max stood and walked over to Sarah, resting his head on her knee in a gesture of solidarity. that reminded her why she did this work in the first place. She scratched behind his ears and felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. Her phone buzzed with a text from Chen. Encryption specialist arrived. Initial decrypt in progress. Preliminary results show transaction records dating back 3 years. Sarah responded quickly. Send everything to my secure email. I'm going to trace Sullivan's movements after release. She accessed the department's surveillance network and began pulling footage from external cameras positioned around the precinct. Sullivan had left through the main entrance at 17:43, walking into the rain with his legal team. They had moved to a black Mercedes sedan parked across the street, and Sarah watched as Sullivan climbed into the back seat while his attorneys loaded into a second vehicle. The Mercedes pulled away from the curb and headed south on Peachtree Street, disappearing from the camera's range within seconds. Sarah switched to traffic camera feeds and picked up the Mercedes at 3 intersections, heading toward Buckhead, Atlanta's affluent northern district where corporate headquarters and expensive residential properties dominated the landscape. The vehicle eventually turned into a gated community called Preston Hollow, a development known for its privacy and security measures that made it popular with executives and wealthy professionals who valued discretion. She couldn't access the community's internal cameras without a warrant, but she didn't need to. The fact that Sullivan had gone directly to such a secure location told her everything about his confidence level. He wasn't hiding or running. He was returning to his life as if nothing had happened, protected by lawyers, federal connections, and the belief that the Atlanta PD couldn't touch him. Sarah made a note of the address and began researching Preston Hollow's resident records. Sullivan wasn't listed as a property owner, but cross-referencing with corporate registrations revealed that one of the homes was owned by a shell company called Cascade Holdings, which shared board members with Meridian Solutions. The connections were becoming clearer, each piece of evidence reinforcing the others in a pattern that was simultaneously elegant and damning. Her computer chimed with an incoming email from Chen. The subject line read, "Urgent decryption results." Sarah opened it and began reading the attached summary. The flash drives contained detailed transaction records showing shipments of pharmaceutical products being moved through legitimate channels but with falsified customs declarations and manipulated documentation. The actual cargo included synthetic opioids, counterfeit medications, and chemical precursors for drug manufacturing. The operation had generated over $40 million in the past 3 years alone, with payments flowing through offshore accounts and shell companies that obscured the true ownership structure. But the most damning information came from a separate file labeled Insurance. It contained audio recordings of conversations between Sullivan and various officials, including 2 FBI agents, a customs inspector, and someone identified only as the coordinator. The conversations were coded and careful, but their meaning was obvious. Sullivan had been gathering evidence against his own handlers, creating leverage to ensure his protection remained in place, even if political winds shifted or new administrators took over federal agencies. Sarah leaned back in her chair and processed the implications. Sullivan wasn't just a criminal operating under federal protection. He was blackmailing the people who were supposed to be controlling him, ensuring his immunity by threatening to expose the corruption that enabled his operations. It was a power play that explained his confidence, his lack of concern during interrogation, and his certainty that he would walk free regardless of what local law enforcement suspected. Max suddenly stood and moved to the office door, his ears forward and his body tense. Sarah heard footsteps approaching again, but these were different from Garrett's measured stride. These were quick and purposeful, multiple sets moving in coordination. She stood just as Webb appeared in the doorway, his face flushed and his expression urgent. "We've got a problem," Webb said. "2 FBI agents just arrived at the precinct. They're in Garrett's office right now." And they're demanding access to the Sullivan evidence. Sarah felt ice form in her chest. How did they know? I don't know, but someone tipped them off fast. They got here less than 2 hours after we found that compartment. Where's the evidence now? Still in the forensics lab with Chen. I told her not to release anything without direct authorization from you or Garrett. Sarah moved past Webb into the hallway with Max at her side. They headed toward Garrett's office, navigating through the maze of corridors that connected different sections of the precinct. As they approached, Sarah could hear raised voices behind the closed door, the tone sharp and confrontational. She paused outside and listened. "This is a matter of federal jurisdiction," a man's voice said, clipped and authoritative. "The Atlanta Police Department has inadvertently interfered with an ongoing operation. We need immediate access to all materials recovered from the suspect's holding cell." Garrett's response was measured but firm. "With respect, Agent Morrison, this is an active local investigation. Any evidence collected on these premises remains under our chain of custody until proper legal process is followed." "Captain Garrett, I don't think you understand the sensitivity of this situation. Derek Sullivan is part of a classified operation targeting international drug trafficking networks. Your interference could jeopardize years of investigative work. Then I'm sure you won't mind providing proper documentation of that operation, including judicial authorization for his protected status." There was a pause. Then a woman's voice entered the conversation. "Captain, we're not here to create conflict. We simply need to ensure that sensitive materials don't compromise ongoing federal operations. Surely we can reach an accommodation." Sarah recognized the tactic immediately. One agent playing aggressive, while the other adopted a more reasonable tone, classic interrogation psychology designed to make the subject feel like cooperation was the path of least resistance. She knocked once on the door and entered without waiting for permission. The office was crowded with Garrett behind his desk and 2 federal agents standing in front of it. Agent Morrison was in his mid-40s with steel-grey hair and a suit that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly salary. His partner was younger, maybe early 30s, with sharp features and eyes that catalogued everything in the room within seconds of Sarah's entrance. Both wore their credentials on lanyards around their necks, FBI shields clearly visible. "Lieutenant Collins," Garrett said, "these are Special Agents Morrison and Rivera from the FBI's Atlanta field office. They're here regarding the Sullivan evidence." "Ooh," Morrison turned his attention to Sarah with an expression that suggested he was already tired of dealing with local law enforcement complications. "Lieutenant, I understand you were responsible for recovering materials from the suspect's cell." "That's correct. My K-9 partner detected a hidden compartment containing evidence of criminal activity. The evidence related to an ongoing federal investigation," Morrison corrected, "which means it falls under federal jurisdiction and must be transferred to our custody immediately." "I'd be happy to facilitate that transfer once I see proper documentation establishing federal jurisdiction," Sarah replied. "Warrants, court orders, whatever legal authorization you have for seizing evidence from an active Atlanta PD investigation." Rivera stepped forward, her tone conciliatory. "Lieutenant Collins, we understand your dedication to protocol, but this is a time-sensitive matter. Derek Sullivan is part of a larger investigation that involves national security implications. Every moment we waste debating jurisdiction is a moment that compromises our ability to prevent serious harm." "Then I'm sure you'll understand why we need to verify those claims through proper channels," Sarah said. "If Sullivan is truly part of a sanctioned federal operation, there will be documentation to support that. We can wait for you to produce it." Morrison's patience appeared to evaporate. "Lieutenant, you're dangerously close to obstruction of justice. If you refuse to cooperate with a federal investigation, there will be consequences." Max growled low in his throat, responding to the aggressive tone. Sarah placed a hand on his head to calm him, but she didn't back down. Threatening a police officer doesn't constitute legal authorization, Agent Morrison. I suggest you contact your supervisors and secure proper documentation. Until then, the evidence remains in our custody. Morrison took a step closer, his face reddening. You have no idea what you're interfering with. Sullivan's operation is part of a controlled infiltration strategy targeting a pharmaceutical trafficking network that spans 3 continents. If you expose his cover, you'll be responsible for destroying years of work and potentially getting people killed. If that's true, then you should have no problem proving it through official channels, Sarah countered. File a motion in federal court. Present your case to a judge and we'll comply with whatever legal orders are issued. But I'm not handing over evidence based on verbal claims and intimidation tactics. Garrett stood from his desk, inserting himself physically between Sarah and the federal agents. Gentlemen and Agent Rivera, I think we've reached an impasse. Lieutenant Collins has outlined our position clearly. We're happy to cooperate with federal authorities through appropriate legal channels. Until such channels are properly established, the evidence remains in our custody. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do. Morrison stared at Garrett for a long moment, his jaw clenched. Then he pulled out his phone and stepped toward the door. You're making a serious mistake, Captain. This conversation isn't over. The 2 agents left, their footsteps echoing aggressively down the hallway. Sarah waited until she was certain they were out of earshot before turning to Garrett. They didn't have any documentation. If Sullivan was really part of a sanctioned operation, they would have come here with court orders and federal warrants. They're trying to intimidate us into giving up the evidence before we can analyze it properly. Which means whatever's on those flash drives is damaging enough that they can't afford to have it become public, Garrett said. He moved to his office window and looked out at the parking lot below. They'll be back with lawyers and federal prosecutors. We've got maybe 12 hours before they get a judge to issue a seizure order. Then we need to work fast, Sarah said. Chen's already decrypting the files. If we can document the criminal activity and establish that Sullivan's operation isn't a legitimate federal investigation, but rather a corrupt protection scheme, we might be able to get ahead of their legal maneuvers. Webb appeared in the doorway. I've got the surveillance footage you requested. There's something you need to see. They followed him to a conference room where he had set up a laptop connected to a large display screen. The image showed the holding block corridor from an overhead angle, time-stamped 46 hours earlier. Webb fast-forwarded through hours of empty corridor until a figure appeared entering the frame at 02:17 in the morning. Sarah leaned closer to the screen. The figure was wearing a maintenance uniform and carrying a toolbox, but his movements were too deliberate, too focused. He walked directly to Sullivan's cell and entered without the hesitation of someone performing routine work. The camera angle didn't capture the interior of the cell, but the time index showed he remained inside for 17 minutes. When he emerged, his toolbox appeared slightly heavier based on how he carried it. Can you enhance his face? Sarah asked. Webb zoomed in on a frame where the figure briefly looked up toward the camera. The image was grainy but clear enough to show facial features. Sarah didn't recognize him immediately, but she knew how to find out who he was. Run this through facial recognition, cross-reference with department personnel records. Webb initiated the search while Sarah watched the rest of the footage. The maintenance worker left the holding block and disappeared from camera coverage. No other unusual activity appeared in the remaining hours before Sullivan's release. The facial recognition system pinged with a result. Webb opened the file and Sarah felt her suspicions confirmed. The man wasn't a maintenance worker. He was identified as Carl Hendricks, a civilian contractor who handled IT security for the precinct. His access credentials gave him broad clearance throughout the building, and his role put him in position to know security protocols, surveillance blind spots, and the layout of every section, including the holding block. "Pull his employment records," Sarah ordered. "Financial history, known associates, everything." Webb's fingers moved across the keyboard. Within minutes, a profile emerged that told a disturbing story. Hendricks had been hired 18 months ago through a staffing agency that provided technical services to various government facilities. His background check had been clean, his references solid. But a deeper dive into his financial records showed irregular deposits into offshore accounts. Payments that coincided with major shipments documented in Sullivan's flash drive records. "He's been on Sullivan's payroll from the start," Webb said. "Every time Sullivan needed inside access or information about departmental procedures, Hendricks provided it." Sarah felt anger rising in her chest. The system was supposed to have safeguards against this kind of infiltration. Background checks and vetting procedures designed to prevent criminals from placing assets inside law enforcement facilities. But those safeguards only worked if everyone involved was acting in good faith. If Sullivan had federal protection, then the people who should have been watching for corruption were instead facilitating it. "Where is Hendricks now?" Sarah asked. Webb checked the personnel database. "Off duty. He clocked out at 1600 hours. Home address is listed in Decatur. Get a warrant for his arrest and for searching his residence. I want him in custody before he realizes we've identified him." Garrett entered the conference room, carrying a folder thick with papers. "I've been reviewing our legal options. The FBI is going to argue that Sullivan's operation falls under federal jurisdiction regardless of where the evidence was found. They'll claim that anything related to his activities is covered by existing federal warrants and investigation parameters." "Can they actually do that?" Webb asked. "In theory, yes. Federal jurisdiction supersedes state and local authority in cases involving interstate commerce and national security. But there's a catch. If we can demonstrate that the federal protection was itself part of a criminal conspiracy, that agents were knowingly enabling illegal activity rather than conducting a legitimate investigation, then the protection becomes invalid and the evidence remains admissible in state court." Sarah considered the implications. "We need proof that the federal agents were corrupt, not just incompetent or following misguided policies." "Exactly. And that's going to be difficult to establish without access to internal FBI communications and documentation that they'll never voluntarily provide." Sarah thought about the audio recordings Chen had mentioned in her email. What if Sullivan already gave us that proof? The flash drives contain recordings of conversations with his handlers. If those recordings show agents knowingly facilitating illegal operations in exchange for payments or other benefits, that's evidence of corruption. Garrett's expression shifted from skeptical to interested. "You have those recordings. Chen is analyzing them now. Sullivan labeled them as insurance, which suggests he was gathering leverage against his own handlers. Then we need to prioritize getting those recordings transcribed and verified. If they contain what you think they contain, they could be our way around the federal jurisdiction claim." Sarah's phone buzzed with another message from Chen. "You need to get down here right now. I found something in the recordings that changes everything." Sarah looked at Garrett and Webb. "Let's go." They made their way back to the forensics lab where Chen was waiting with an expression that managed to combine excitement and dread in equal measure. She gestured them toward her computer terminal where an audio waveform filled the screen. "I've been processing the recordings sequentially, working through them in chronological order. Most of it is exactly what you'd expect. Coded conversations, careful language, nothing explicitly incriminating. But then I found this." She pressed play. The audio quality was surprisingly clear, suggesting Sullivan had used high-grade recording equipment. A man's voice emerged from the speakers, deep and measured. "The shipment arrives in Savannah on Thursday. Make sure customs is handled." Sullivan's voice responded, "Already arranged. Inspector Chen is on the schedule. He'll process the containers without physical inspection." "And the distribution network?" "Meridian has trucks waiting. Product will be dispersed to regional facilities within 48 hours of arrival." "What about local law enforcement? Any exposure risks?" Sullivan laughed, the sound confident and dismissive. "Atlanta PD doesn't have the resources or the awareness to interfere. They're focused on street-level operations. They don't look at pharmaceutical shipments or corporate logistics. Keep it that way. The moment local cops start asking questions, we have a problem." "Understood. But I've taken precautions. If anything goes wrong, I have insurance, recordings, documents, everything needed to expose the entire operation. Call it mutually assured destruction." The recording ended. Chen stopped playback and looked at the group assembled around her terminal. That was recorded 6 months ago. The other voice is identified through voice print analysis as Special Agent Robert Morrison, the same agent who was just in Captain Garrett's office. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications. Morrison wasn't just protecting Sullivan through official channels. He was actively coordinating criminal operations, facilitating smuggling routes, and ensuring that local law enforcement remained ignorant of the activities happening in their own jurisdiction. "That's direct evidence of corruption," Garrett said quietly. "Not operational oversight or questionable tactics. That's an FBI agent actively participating in drug trafficking." Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and rage. She had been right to trust Max's instincts, right to push forward when everyone else wanted to close the case. But the confirmation came with the realization that the conspiracy was even deeper than she had suspected. Morrison wasn't a handler who had lost control of his asset. He was a partner in the criminal enterprise. "We need to make copies of everything," Sarah said. "Multiple copies, stored in different locations. If the FBI gets a court order to seize this evidence, I want backups that can't be accessed or destroyed." Chen nodded and began the process of duplicating the files to encrypted external drives. Webb pulled out his phone and made calls to arrange Hendrix's arrest warrant and coordinate with officers in Decatur to secure his residence. Garrett returned to his office to brief the district attorney's office on the latest developments and begin preparing the legal framework for prosecuting both Sullivan and Morrison. Sarah walked to the window, overlooking the precinct parking lot. Max followed and sat beside her, his presence a steady comfort in the midst of escalating chaos. She could see the rain continuing to fall on the city, the neon lights of downtown Atlanta reflecting off wet pavement in streaks of red and blue and green. Somewhere out there, Sullivan was sitting in his protected mansion believing he had won, unaware that the evidence he thought was safely hidden had been discovered and was now being used to build the case that would destroy him. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. Sarah answered cautiously. "Collins." A woman's voice, professional and urgent. "Lieutenant Collins, my name is Jessica Reeves. I'm an investigative journalist with the Atlanta Herald. I've been tracking pharmaceutical industry corruption for the past 2 years, and I believe we have overlapping interests regarding Derek Sullivan and Meridian Solutions." Sarah's instincts immediately went on high alert. "How did you get this number?" "I have sources throughout the law enforcement community, but that's not important right now. What's important is that I have information you need, and you have confirmation of things I've been trying to prove. We should meet. I don't discuss active investigations with reporters, even when those reporters have documentary evidence of FBI corruption that your department can't access through official channels. Lieutenant, I know about the hidden compartment in Sullivan's cell. I know about the flash drives, and I know that agents Morrison and Rivera are going to use every tool at their disposal to make that evidence disappear. But they can't make me disappear, and they can't suppress information that's already been published." Sarah hesitated. Journalists could be valuable allies in exposing corruption, but they could also be liabilities that compromised investigations by publishing sensitive information prematurely. What exactly do you have? Financial records showing payments from offshore accounts controlled by Meridian Solutions to FBI agents, including Morrison. Email communications discussing operational parameters. Shipping manifests that prove Sullivan's network has been moving contraband through legitimate pharmaceutical channels for over 3 years. And most importantly, I have corroboration from a former FBI agent who worked with Morrison and is willing to testify about the corruption. That got Sarah's full attention. A whistleblower from inside the FBI could provide the kind of insider testimony that would be nearly impossible for Morrison's lawyers to discredit. Where do you want to meet? There's a diner called Martha's on Ponce de Leon. 24 hours, neutral ground. I can be there in 30 minutes. I'll be there in 45. Sarah ended the call and turned to find Webb standing in the doorway. That was a journalist who claims to have evidence of FBI corruption related to Sullivan. Webb's expression showed concern. Could be a setup. Morrison might be trying to draw you out into the open where he can control the situation. It's possible, but if she really does have a federal whistleblower, that could be the missing piece we need. You're not going alone. I'm taking Max. That's not enough. I'm coming with you. Sarah started to argue, but recognized the futility. Webb was right. Walking into a meeting with an unknown contact while federal agents were actively working against her was dangerous. Having backup made tactical sense, even if her pride wanted to insist she could handle it alone. They left the precinct 20 minutes later in Sarah's unmarked sedan, Max secure in the back seat with his tactical harness and the K-9 unit identification clearly visible on his vest. The rain had lightened to a persistent drizzle that made the streets slick and reflective. Sarah drove through the familiar corridors of Atlanta, past the gleaming towers of downtown and into the older neighborhoods where restaurants and shops had been serving the same communities for decades. Martha's Diner occupied a corner lot with a neon sign that had probably been installed in the 1960s and never replaced. The interior was visible through large windows, showing red vinyl booths and a counter lined with chrome stools. A handful of late-night customers sat scattered throughout, nursing coffee and picking at pie. Sarah parked across the street where she had a clear view of both the entrance and the surrounding area. "That's her," Webb said, gesturing toward a booth near the back where a woman sat alone with a laptop open in front of her. Jessica Reeves looked to be in her late 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and professional attire that suggested she had come straight from her office. She was watching the entrance with the alertness of someone who understood she was meeting with law enforcement in a situation that involved federal corruption. Sarah and Webb entered the diner with Max walking between them. Several customers looked up with interest at the K-9 unit, but no one seemed alarmed. Sarah slid into the booth across from Reeves, while Webb took up position at the counter where he could watch both the entrance and their booth simultaneously. "Lieutenant Collins," Reeves said, "thank you for coming. Let's skip the pleasantries. Show me what you have." Reeves turned her laptop so Sarah could see the screen. It displayed a spreadsheet showing financial transactions flowing from various offshore accounts into domestic bank accounts belonging to Robert Morrison and 2 other FBI agents whose names Sarah didn't immediately recognize. The amounts were substantial. Hundreds of thousands of dollars spread across multiple years, timed to coincide with major seizure operations and case closures that had suspiciously favorable outcomes for certain pharmaceutical companies. "These are wire transfers I obtained through a source in international banking," Reeves explained. "The offshore accounts are controlled by shell companies that ultimately trace back to Meridian Solutions. The domestic accounts belong to FBI agents who were supposed to be investigating pharmaceutical trafficking, but were instead facilitating it." Sarah studied the figures and saw the pattern immediately. Every time Sullivan's network completed a major shipment, payments flowed to Morrison and his associates. It was a protection racket operating under the cover of federal law enforcement, using the very authority meant to stop crime to enable and profit from it. "You said you have a whistleblower," Sarah prompted. Reeves nodded and pulled out her phone. She placed a call on speaker. After 3 rings, a man's voice answered. "This is Castellano." Sarah recognized the name from her earlier research. Robert Castellano, the FBI consultant who works for Meridian Solutions. Former FBI, Castellano corrected. "I retired 2 years ago, and I stopped working for Meridian 6 months ago when I realized what they were actually doing." "Why should I believe you're legitimate and not another part of Sullivan's protection network?" "Because I have nothing to gain and everything to lose by talking to you, Lieutenant. I spent 30 years building a reputation in federal law enforcement. Morrison and his team are destroying that reputation and betraying everything the FBI is supposed to stand for. I can't stop them through internal channels because the corruption goes too high. But I can provide testimony and documentation that proves they've been operating a criminal enterprise under federal authority." "What kind of documentation?" "Internal FBI memos authorizing Sullivan's activities, communications between Morrison and Justice Department officials discussing how to handle potential exposure, financial records showing how seized assets were redirected to offshore accounts instead of being properly processed through federal forfeiture procedures. Everything you need to prove this isn't a legitimate investigation gone wrong, but rather a coordinated criminal conspiracy." Sarah felt pieces falling into place. Castellano wasn't just a whistleblower. He was an insurance policy that Sullivan probably didn't know existed. "Why now? Why come forward at this moment?" "Because I know Morrison is going to get a federal judge to issue a seizure order for your evidence. Once he has custody of those flash drives, they'll disappear, and Sullivan will walk away clean again. This might be the only chance to stop them." Reeves leaned forward. "I've been working with Castellano for 3 months, verifying his information and building a story that can't be suppressed. But I need official confirmation from law enforcement to publish. Your evidence from Sullivan's cell, combined with Castellano's testimony and my financial records, creates a package that's impossible to dismiss as conspiracy theory or speculation." Sarah considered the strategic landscape. Publishing the story would prevent Morrison from burying the evidence through legal maneuvers, but it would also compromise the investigation by alerting Sullivan and his network to move or destroy anything that hadn't yet been discovered. It was a calculated risk, with significant downsides, but the alternative was worse. If they tried to build the case quietly, through official channels, Morrison would use his federal authority to shut them down at every turn. Courts would defer to FBI claims of national security. Evidence would be sealed, witnesses would be intimidated or relocated. Sullivan would continue operating under protection while Sarah and her team faced professional consequences for daring to challenge federal authority. "How long until you're ready to publish?" Sarah asked. "I can have the story finalized within 24 hours. But I need your confirmation that the evidence you recovered corroborates what Castellano has provided." Sarah made her decision. "The evidence includes audio recordings of Morrison coordinating drug shipments with Sullivan, financial records showing millions of dollars flowing through Meridian Solutions, and GPS coordinates documenting a trafficking network spanning 3 continents. Everything Castellano has told you appears to be accurate based on what we've found." Reeves began typing rapidly on her laptop. "Can you provide me with any of the actual evidence files? Having the recordings or documents to publish alongside the story would make it incontrovertible." Sarah knew she was crossing a line by sharing case evidence with a journalist. But circumstances had forced her hand. I'll have my forensics team send you encrypted copies of selected files, but you don't publish until I give you clearance. We need time to coordinate the arrests. Agreed. I'll have the story ready, but won't release it without your go-ahead. Sarah stood from the booth. Castellano, are you willing to provide sworn testimony? Yes. I'll testify in any court about what I witnessed and what I know. Then we need to get you into protective custody immediately. Morrison will come after you the moment he realizes you're talking. I expected that. I have a secure location already arranged. Sarah ended the call and looked at Reeves. You're taking a significant risk. Morrison has resources to retaliate against journalists who expose him. Reeves smiled grimly. I've been threatened by better criminals than corrupt FBI agents, Lieutenant. The Atlanta Herald has legal protection and editorial backing. Morrison can try to suppress this story, but he won't succeed. Sarah left the diner with Webb and Max, returning to the vehicle with her mind racing through tactical considerations. Publishing the story would force everything into the open, creating public pressure that made it impossible for Morrison to hide behind federal authority claims. But it also meant they needed to move quickly on arrests before Sullivan and his network scattered. Back in the sedan, Webb voiced the concern Sarah was already processing. Once that story goes live, all hell breaks loose. The FBI will claim we leaked sensitive information. The DA's office will face political pressure. This could blow up in our faces. It's already blown up, Sarah replied. Morrison came to the precinct personally to demand the evidence. That tells us he's desperate. We either act now with the element of surprise, or we wait for him to outmaneuver us through legal channels. Her phone rang again. Chen's name appeared on the display. Talk to me. I've finished analyzing all the GPS coordinates from the flash drives. There's a pattern. Most of the locations are past shipment sites, but 3 coordinates are flagged with future timestamps. One of them is scheduled for tomorrow night at the port of Savannah. Sarah felt adrenaline spike. What kind of shipment? According to the coded references, it's labeled as pharmaceutical supplies, but based on the previous pattern, it's almost certainly contraband. And here's the interesting part. The notation includes Sullivan's initials and Morrison's FBI designation. They're both going to be present for this shipment. Sarah looked at Webb. We've got them. If we can catch Sullivan and Morrison together at an active trafficking operation, we have everything we need for arrests and prosecution. Savannah is outside our jurisdiction, Webb pointed out. Then we coordinate with Savannah PD and federal prosecutors who aren't corrupt. This is bigger than jurisdictional boundaries. They returned to the precinct, where Garrett was waiting with news of his own. I've been in contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office. There's a prosecutor named Ellen Bradford who has been investigating pharmaceutical industry corruption independently. She's willing to work with us on Sullivan and Morrison, but she needs solid evidence before she can move against federal agents. We have that evidence, Sarah said, and we have a meeting point where both targets will be present tomorrow night. Garrett's expression showed both concern and determination. Savannah is 4 hours away. We'll need support from local agencies and authorization to operate outside our jurisdiction. Chen can coordinate with Savannah PD. Webb can handle logistics and tactical planning. I'll reach out to Bradford and walk her through the evidence package. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of coordination, planning, and preparation. Sarah compiled detailed briefing materials for Bradford, including transcripts of the audio recordings, financial documents showing the corruption network, and sworn statements from Castellano about the FBI's involvement. Bradford reviewed everything with the careful attention of a prosecutor who understood she was about to challenge powerful institutional interests. "This is strong," Bradford said during a video conference call at 2 a.m. "Strong enough to secure arrest warrants for both Sullivan and Morrison. But we need to execute this operation perfectly. Any procedural errors will give their defense attorneys ammunition to challenge the evidence." "We'll do it by the book," Sarah assured her. "Every step documented, every action within legal boundaries." Bradford authorized the warrants and coordinated with Savannah law enforcement to provide tactical support. The plan was straightforward in concept, but complex in execution. Surveillance teams would confirm Sullivan and Morrison's presence at the port. Once both targets were positively identified, engaged in criminal activity, combined units from Atlanta PD, Savannah PD, and FBI agents from the Atlanta field office who were not compromised would move in for simultaneous arrests. Sarah spent the afternoon reviewing tactical plans with Max at her side. The K-9 would play a crucial role in the operation, using his detection capabilities to locate contraband in the containers before any of the suspects could claim the shipment was legitimate pharmaceutical cargo. His nose would provide probable cause that couldn't be disputed or dismissed. At 1600 hours, Sarah, Webb, Max, and a tactical team of 6 officers departed Atlanta in a convoy of unmarked vehicles. The drive to Savannah took them through Georgia's rural interior, past small towns and agricultural land that eventually gave way to the coastal plain where Spanish moss hung from ancient oak trees and the air carried the salt tang of the nearby Atlantic. They arrived at a staging area 3 miles from the port of Savannah as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The port was one of the busiest on the East Coast, a sprawling complex of container yards, warehouses, and dock facilities where cargo ships from around the world loaded and unloaded goods around the clock. Surveillance teams had already confirmed unusual activity at Terminal 12, where a container ship registered in Liberia had docked 2 hours earlier. Sarah studied the port layout on a tactical map, while Webb coordinated with Savannah units over radio. The terminal consisted of multiple storage areas, separated by access roads and security checkpoints. Chen had provided the specific container number they were targeting, MSCU 4782361, which should be located in the northern section of the terminal, awaiting customs clearance. "Teams are in position," Webb reported. "Surveillance confirms 4 vehicles on site matching descriptions from Sullivan's network. We've identified Morrison's personal vehicle in the administrative parking area." Sarah checked her tactical vest and confirmed her sidearm was properly secured. Max sat beside her in full working mode, his harness equipped with a body camera that would record everything he detected during the operation. She ran through the mission parameters one final time, ensuring everyone understood their roles and responsibilities. At 1945, as darkness settled over the port facility, Sullivan's Mercedes arrived at Terminal 12. Surveillance cameras captured him exiting the vehicle and walking toward a cluster of shipping containers where several men were waiting. Morrison appeared 5 minutes later, his presence confirming the coordination between Sullivan's criminal network and his FBI handlers. "All units, this is Collins," Sarah spoke into her radio. "Targets are confirmed on site. Move to intercept positions, but hold for my signal." The tactical teams advanced through the port facility in coordinated movements, using containers and warehouse structures for concealment. Sarah and Max took a position with clear line of sight to the target area. Through her night vision optics, she could see Sullivan gesturing toward a specific container while Morrison checked his phone and appeared to be communicating with someone off-site. A forklift moved into position and began the process of opening the container. As the doors swung wide, Sullivan and Morrison approached to inspect the contents. This was the moment they needed, both targets actively participating in the criminal operation, their involvement undeniable. "Max, seek," Sarah commanded quietly. The K-9 moved forward with purpose, his nose working the air as he approached the container. The men around it noticed Max's approach and began reaching for weapons, but Sarah's voice cut through the tension with law enforcement authority. Federal and local law enforcement, nobody move! The port facility exploded with activity as tactical teams emerged from concealment points, weapons drawn and commands shouted. Sullivan froze with his hands visible, his expression showing shock and rage. Morrison reached for his FBI credentials, attempting to assert authority even as he was being surrounded. "I'm Special Agent Morrison with the FBI," he announced. "This is a federal operation, and you're interfering with—" "You're under arrest for corruption, drug trafficking, and conspiracy," Sarah interrupted. "You have the right to remain silent." Max reached the container and immediately alerted, his behavior confirming the presence of contraband. Sarah moved forward with backup officers and examined the container's contents. Packed among legitimate pharmaceutical supplies were dozens of packages containing white powder that field tests would later confirm as synthetic opioids. The estimated street value exceeded $20 million. Sullivan was placed in handcuffs. His earlier confidence evaporated and replaced with the desperate calculation of someone whose carefully constructed protection had just collapsed. Morrison continued protesting his FBI status until Prosecutor Bradford herself appeared at the scene, having traveled from Atlanta to personally oversee the arrests. "Agent Morrison," Bradford said with cold precision, "your badge doesn't protect you from prosecution when you're committing federal crimes. You're terminated from the FBI effective immediately, and you'll be facing charges that include racketeering, corruption, and drug trafficking conspiracy." The operation concluded with 6 arrests, including Sullivan, Morrison, and 4 members of their trafficking network. The entire sequence had been recorded by body cameras, port security footage, and Max's tactical camera, creating a comprehensive documentation of the criminal activity that would be nearly impossible for defense attorneys to challenge. As the suspects were transported to federal detention, Sarah stood beside Max and watched the container being processed by forensics teams. Webb approached with a satisfied expression. "Chen says the story is ready to publish. She's been coordinating with Reeves at the Herald. They're just waiting for your authorization." Sarah pulled out her phone and sent a single-word text message to Reeves, "Publish." 20 minutes later, the Atlanta Herald's website posted a comprehensive investigative report detailing the corruption network, complete with financial records, audio recordings, and sworn testimony from Castellano. The story spread rapidly across news networks and social media, generating immediate public outrage and political pressure for accountability. The FBI's Atlanta field office issued a statement condemning Morrison's actions and announcing a comprehensive internal investigation. The Justice Department assigned a special prosecutor to review the entire case and determine how extensively the corruption had spread through federal agencies. Meridian Solutions' corporate offices were raided by federal agents, its executives placed under investigation, and its pharmaceutical distribution licenses suspended pending review. Sarah returned to Atlanta in the early morning hours, exhausted but satisfied. The case had started with Max scratching at a wall in a holding cell and evolved into the exposure of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of federal law enforcement. It wasn't a complete victory. She knew that corruption had a way of adapting and re-emerging under new forms, but it was justice delivered in a situation where justice had seemed impossible. Captain Garrett met her in the precinct parking lot as she arrived. "You made a lot of enemies tonight, Lieutenant. The FBI brass is furious. Morrison's lawyers are already threatening to sue the department, and there are people in Washington who would prefer this story had never come to light." "I know, sir. But Max found evidence, we followed where it led, and we did everything by the book." Garrett allowed himself a small smile. "Yes, you did. And because of that, they can't touch you. Well done, Lieutenant. Now get some rest. You've earned it." Sarah walked into the precinct with Max at her side, the K-9's tail wagging with the satisfaction of a job well completed. Other officers looked up from their work and nodded acknowledgement, recognizing that something significant had occurred even if they didn't yet know all the details. In her office, Sarah removed Max's tactical harness and poured fresh water into his bowl. He drank deeply, then settled onto his bed with a contented sigh. Sarah sat at her desk and began the lengthy process of completing after-action reports and documentation that would be required for the prosecution. Her phone buzzed with a call from Reeves. "Lieutenant Collins, the story is generating massive response. Multiple news organizations are picking it up. Congressional committees are already announcing investigations. You've exposed something that people have been trying to hide for years." "I just followed the evidence." "You did more than that. You trusted your K-9 partner when everyone else wanted to close the case. That's what made the difference." Sarah looked at Max, sleeping peacefully in his bed, his ears occasionally twitching as he dreamed of whatever scenarios played out in a police dog's subconscious. He had been right about the wall, right about the hidden compartment, right about there being more to find when every human investigator had been ready to give up. "Max is the real hero here," Sarah said. "I just gave him the chance to do his job." Over the following weeks, the legal proceedings unfolded with the momentum of a case built on overwhelming evidence. Sullivan and Morrison both attempted to negotiate plea agreements, but Bradford refused to offer anything less than full prosecution on all charges. Castellano provided detailed testimony about the corruption network, his insider knowledge corroborating every element of the case. The jury deliberations lasted less than a day before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Sullivan was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. Morrison received 28 years, his FBI service counting for nothing in the face of his betrayal of public trust. The other defendants received sentences ranging from 15 to 20 years, ensuring that the trafficking network Sullivan had built would remain dismantled for the foreseeable future. Sarah attended the sentencing hearing with Max beside her. As the judge announced Morrison's sentence, the former FBI agent turned in his seat and stared at her with undisguised hatred. She met his gaze without expression, allowing the moment to confirm what he undoubtedly already understood, that his downfall had begun with a K-9 scratching at a cell wall and ended with justice delivered despite every advantage he thought he possessed. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered with cameras and microphones. Sarah declined most interview requests, but she did stop to make a brief statement that would be broadcast nationally. "This case demonstrates the importance of trusting our K-9 partners and following evidence wherever it leads, regardless of how powerful the people involved might be. Max detected something that everyone else missed, and that discovery exposed a conspiracy that had operated with impunity for years. If there's a lesson here, it's that no one is above the law, and sometimes a dog's nose is more reliable than human assumptions." The Atlanta PD K-9 unit received commendations for their work on the case, and Max specifically was awarded the department's highest honor for service. The ceremony was held in front of City Hall, with media coverage and community attendance. Max accepted his medal with appropriate dignity, sitting at attention while the mayor praised his dedication and instincts. Sarah knew that accolades and ceremonies weren't why she did this work. She did it because justice mattered, because victims deserved advocacy, and because the law was supposed to apply equally, regardless of wealth or position or connections. Derek Sullivan had believed himself untouchable, protected by federal corruption and sophisticated networks that could manipulate the system to serve criminal purposes. He had been wrong, and his downfall served as a reminder that the system could still work when people refused to be intimidated or deterred. Months after the case concluded, Sarah was working on routine patrol when she received a call from the precinct dispatcher. "Lieutenant Collins, We have a situation at the federal courthouse, requesting K-9 support for a security sweep. It was the kind of call she responded to regularly. The daily work of law enforcement that didn't involve conspiracies or corruption, but simply providing professional service to ensure public safety. She acknowledged the call, and Max rose from his resting position in the back of her patrol vehicle, ready to work. As they drove toward the courthouse, Sarah reflected on how one case had changed her perspective on both the vulnerabilities and the resilience of the justice system. Corruption existed at every level, and powerful people would always attempt to manipulate institutions to serve their own interests. But resistance was possible. Truth could emerge even when buried under layers of protection and conspiracy. And sometimes, justice required nothing more complicated than trusting a K-9's instincts and refusing to close a case just because closing it would be easier than pursuing the truth. The rain had returned to Atlanta, washing the streets clean and reflecting the city lights in patterns that turned ordinary pavement into something almost beautiful. Sarah pulled up to the courthouse and let Max out of the vehicle, his black harness marking him as a professional working dog whose judgment could be trusted absolutely. They walked into the building together, partners in the most fundamental sense, ready to do their jobs with the same dedication they brought to every assignment, whether it involved exposing corruption or simply ensuring that a courthouse was secure. The Sullivan case would define Sarah's career in many ways, but it wouldn't define her purpose. That purpose remained what it had always been, serving the community, protecting the vulnerable, and ensuring that the law applied fairly to everyone, regardless of their power or influence. Max's tail wagged slightly as they entered the courthouse security area, his enthusiasm for work never diminished by success or recognition. He was ready for the next assignment, the next challenge, the next opportunity to use his remarkable capabilities in service of justice. And Sarah was ready too, her hand resting lightly on Max's head as they walked forward into whatever came next. A team that had proven that sometimes the truth really was hidden in walls, waiting to be discovered by someone willing to trust their instincts and refuse to accept that any case was ever truly closed.